Imagine mist curling around the ancient stones of Stonehenge, each monolith a silent witness to a forgotten world. The camera glides low across the damp grass, revealing burial mounds, still undisturbed, that hold secrets no one living could ever remember. And then a voice speaks, steady and low. What if I told you the people who built this were erased? Not just from memory, but from blood. Across the expanse of ancient Europe, a mystery once haunted archaeologists for decades. Who were the Bell Beaker people? Were they merchants, masons, warriors? Why did their distinct pottery appear almost overnight from the Iberian coast to the British Isles, from the Rhine to the Po? The same beaker-shaped vessels, the same copper daggers, the same archery kits, but in graves of people who, as we now know, shared no ancestry at all. For years, the experts argued, did the culture spread through trade routes and shared ideas? Or was it something far more profound, a mass movement of people, changing not just tools, but bloodlines? The answer, for too long, lay buried. But now, with the advent of ancient DNA science, we are peering into a vault long sealed, a vault of bones, of lineage, of shocking truths that have rewritten European prehistory. This isn't the story of one tribe. It's the story of an upheaval so vast that it replaced entire populations, quietly, thoroughly, and without leaving behind a single written word. In a lonely grave near Amesbury, a man was found buried with gold ornaments and archer's gear. But isotope analysis revealed something eerie. He wasn't local. He was born far to the east, across the Alps, likely in the region of modern-day Germany. And yet, here he lay, just miles from Stonehenge. This Amesbury Archer, as archaeologists called him, wasn't an isolated case. He was a harbinger, a sign that something enormous was stirring across the continent, a wave of migration that would leave no region untouched. We now know that by 2500 BC, the genetic makeup of Britain was on the verge of catastrophe, not from war, but from replacement. Within just a few centuries, nearly 90% of the island's ancient DNA vanished. The people who raised the stones, cultivated the land, and buried their dead in ritualized tombs were gone. And in their place stood newcomers, carrying foreign genes, new technologies, and a culture that looked familiar but was anything but. This isn't just Britain's story. This is Europe's hidden revolution. A story not of empires, but of silent conquerors. Not of written conquests, but of genetic domination. Because the Bell Beaker culture wasn't just an archaeological phenomenon. It was a demographic avalanche. And its trail begins in places few would expect, with ancestries rooted deep in the Pontic Caspian steppe, riding waves of migration that would sweep westward until even the Atlantic stood no further ground. And so, under layers of soil, under centuries of silence, a question now echoes louder than ever before. How did an entire people vanish from the record, leaving only their stones behind? Some stories don't begin with kings or battles. They begin with a cup, a simple clay vessel, flared like a bell, its surface etched with patterns older than any alphabet. Found in burial sites from the windswept cliffs of Ireland to the sun-baked plains of Portugal, these beakers emerged like a whisper across the continent, yet they carried no signature of empire, no trail of conquest, just silence and sameness. For generations, archaeologists bent over these artifacts and wondered, who were the people behind them? Was this pottery the footprint of an invisible nation, marching westward with copper daggers and archery gear? Or was it something more elusive, an idea, an aesthetic, a fashion that swept through Europe like a breeze, changing customs but not the people beneath? It was a riddle that refused to be solved. In Germany, the same beaker pots appeared beside skeletons, with elongated skulls and steppe ancestry. But in Spain, they lay next to the remains of local Copper Age farmers, people whose DNA hadn't changed for generations. How could one culture bind together populations with no common origin, no shared blood? The phrase pots, not people, became a mantra in academic circles, the belief that material culture could travel without migration, that pottery styles could leap across rivers and languages without the people themselves ever moving. For a time, it seemed logical. After all, ideas don't need passports. But that explanation had cracks. Too many patterns. Too much uniformity. And then DNA stepped in. Like a torch in a pitch-black cave, ancient genomics began lighting up skeletons that had lain mute for 4,000 years. What emerged was not a single narrative, but revelation. The Bell Beaker culture was not a monolith. It was a mosaic, and the pieces didn't always fit neatly together. In Central Europe, the graves of Beaker-associated individuals contained high levels of steppe ancestry, genetic fingerprints of a long migration that began far to the east. In Iberia, by contrast, the earliest Beaker graves had none. 2 Beakers, 2 graves, worlds apart in blood, yet nearly identical in artifact. This wasn't just puzzling, it was paradigm-breaking. The mystery deepened. Were there multiple waves of Beaker people? Parallel evolutions of the same style? Or had one group adopted the look, while another carried its essence? DNA didn't silence the debate. It amplified it, forcing archaeologists to reevaluate every assumption they'd once held as fact. The truth, it turned out, was neither simple nor singular. The Bell Beaker phenomenon wasn't just a culture. It was a mirror, reflecting back different stories in every region it touched. In some places, it meant migration on an unimaginable scale. In others, it meant a whisper of influence, a gentle assimilation. But one thing was certain. The uniformity of the artifacts masked a chaos beneath. A swirl of genes, languages, identities. This was not a peaceful diffusion, nor a violent conquest. It was something rarer, something harder to trace. A continental reshaping, not by sword, but by lineage. And as the strands of ancient DNA began to pull back the veil, the real question emerged. If the Beakers were just vessels, then what exactly were they carrying? Culture, bloodlines, or both? In the southwest corner of Europe, where the land tilts toward the Atlantic and the light falls golden on ancient stone, something extraordinary began. Long before the rest of the continent caught the scent of copper or etched lines into clay beakers, Iberia was already stirring. Archaeologists speak of this land as the first spark, the place where the so-called Bell Beaker phenomenon ignited. But what if that spark didn't come from newcomers, but from those who were already there? As early as 2700 BC, Iberian communities began burying their dead with beakers, bell-shaped, finely decorated, unmistakably iconic. But when scientists exhumed their bones thousands of years later, the DNA told an unexpected story. These early Beaker people were not outsiders. They were local. Their ancestry tied back to Neolithic farmers and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had walked Iberia's rugged valleys for millennia. The Beakers were new. The genes were not. This revelation turned assumptions upside down. The Iberians hadn't been conquered or overrun. They had adopted the Beaker package on their own terms. They crafted the vessels, shaped the copper, and buried their dead with the same rituals seen 1,000 miles away, all without a wave of migrants flooding their shores. For a moment in history, culture moved faster than blood. But the peace didn't last. Around 2500 BC, the winds began to shift. From the north, across the Pyrenees and down into the river valleys, came a new presence, subtle at first, but unmistakable in the DNA. These were people whose ancestors had roamed the Pontic Caspian steppe generations earlier. They carried with them the R1b M269 Y chromosome, a marker almost entirely absent in Iberia before, and soon it would dominate. Within a few centuries, the genetic landscape of Iberia transformed. The male lineages that had defined the region for thousands of years disappeared, almost without a trace. What replaced them was striking. Men from Central Europe, genetically tied to the Beaker groups of Germany and the Netherlands, began to appear in Iberian burials. They didn't just visit, they stayed, settled, married, and rewrote the paternal history of an entire region. But this wasn't a conquest in the traditional sense. There's no evidence of widespread violence, no charred layers of destroyed villages. Instead, what the genomes reveal is something far more complex, admixture. The newcomers didn't erase the local people, they blended with them. In the bones of children buried in northern Spain, scientists found a fusion of ancestries. About 60% Beaker DNA from Central Europe, and 40% local Iberian lineage. It was the birth of a new genetic identity, forged in silence. Still, one fact remains jarring. While maternal lines show continuity, The male genetic turnover is nearly total. It's as if entire generations of Iberian fathers vanished from the record. Why? Was it disease? Social collapse? A shifting of power that favored foreign males in local hierarchies? The answers remain elusive, buried under centuries of silence, but the consequences echo into the present. Because by 2000 BC, Iberia no longer stood apart. Steppe ancestry, once absent, had now embedded itself into the very core of Iberian society. And the R1b P312 lineage, a genetic signature of Beaker males from Central Europe, had become ubiquitous. What had started as an indigenous cultural bloom had been overtaken by waves of new blood. And yet, the story here is not one of loss. It is one of transformation. Iberia reminds us that cultural revolutions and genetic shifts do not always follow the same map. That the first to raise the beaker did not remain unchanged, but neither were they erased. They adapted, absorbed, and reshaped the tide that came to meet them. In the heart of Europe, beyond the Rhine, and across the ancient forests of Bohemia, a transformation unfolded so quietly, it would take 4,000 years to recognize its magnitude. Here, the soil cradled something extraordinary, not just bones and blades, but the genetic recipe for a new people. Central Europe was not merely a waypoint in the Bell Beaker expansion. It was the Crucible, the place where ancestries collided, fused, and birthed a force that would spill across an entire continent. Before the Beakers, this land was already stirring with change. Steppe migrants, descendants of horse-riding herders from the Pontic Caspian plains, had moved westward centuries earlier, blending with the last remnants of Europe's early farmers. Their meeting created a hybrid identity, one that carried both the legacy of grain and the power of the saddle. And from this mixture emerged a new genetic constellation, one defined by the rise of haplogroup R1b M269, a paternal lineage that would soon dominate from the North Sea to the Pyrenees. By 2500 BC, burial sites from the Czech Republic to the Netherlands began to reveal a pattern so consistent it could no longer be coincidence. The men buried beneath the beaker vessels shared more than just artifacts. They shared blood. The same Y chromosome appeared again and again. A lineage that hadn't been common in Europe before now surged like a tide. And it wasn't alone. The maternal lines changed too, less dramatically, but enough to mark the movement of entire families, not just isolated males. The genetic data from these graves told a story beyond culture. This was not simply a fashion trend of pottery or metalwork. It was a demographic reshaping, an event of scale and permanence. The people interred in beaker-associated cemeteries had inherited their DNA from east and west, their genomes woven from distant pasts, yet unified in a new identity. And this zone, this genetic alchemy lab, was anything but isolated. Isotope analysis reveals that individuals buried in Central European beaker sites often spent their childhoods elsewhere. Some came from alpine regions, others from river valleys, far to the north. These weren't static settlements. They were nodal points in a web of migration, drawing people from every direction into a shared horizon. But why here? Why did Central Europe become the forge of this synthesis? Part of the answer lies in geography. This region had long served as a corridor between worlds, between the Danubian plains and the North Sea, between the Baltic tribes and the Mediterranean traders. It was a place of convergence, where ideas, goods, and genes mingled freely. The beaker phenomenon didn't just arrive here. It crystallized here. The archaeological remains deepen the narrative. In some sites, Bell Beaker graves overlay those of the corded ware culture, a group genetically related, but distinct. Where corded where males often carried the R1a lineage, the incoming beaker-associated groups bore R1b. These were not just variant clans. They were rival lineages, competing traditions. And yet, in some locations, they coexisted, for a time, before one lineage eclipsed the other. What makes this period so mesmerizing is not just the scale of movement, but its coordination. The spread of beaker-associated people was not chaotic. It followed pathways, trade routes, river systems, perhaps even alliances that remain invisible to us. But their impact is undeniable. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, Central Europe had become the launching ground for a people whose genes, customs, and language roots would echo through millennia. And the proof is not just in the bones. It's in the stories of individuals, like the man buried with a full archer's kit near the Elbe, whose DNA links him to communities hundreds of kilometers away, or the child laid to rest in Bohemia with ornaments from distant lands, her genome a perfect blend of steppe and Neolithic ancestry. Each burial is a chapter, each genome a sentence written in blood. This was the alchemy of Central Europe, not a flash of conquest, but a slow-burning forge, a place where movement became memory, and memory became legacy. And from this fusion emerged the people who would carry the Bell Beaker identity westward, not as invaders, but as inheritors of a new world. When the first Bell Beaker artifacts appeared in Britain around 2450 BC, they brought more than just foreign shapes and metal tools. They carried a silent revolution, one that would ripple through every village, every bloodline, and eventually, through every living descendant on the island. What unfolded next wasn't a clash of armies. It wasn't a slow cultural diffusion. It was something far more profound, a near-total transformation of the human fabric that defined the British Isles. The people who lived in Britain before this moment were farmers, descended from Neolithic settlers who had arrived 2 millennia earlier. They built stone tombs, aligned monuments to the stars, and raised the massive sarcens of Stonehenge. Their society was stable, their traditions deep. But within just a few generations of the Beaker arrival, their genetic legacy would all but disappear. Ancient DNA, extracted from skeletons across England and Wales, tells the story with brutal clarity. By the time Bell Beaker practices had taken root, the island's population had shifted so drastically that nearly 90% of the earlier gene pool had vanished. The old bloodlines, those of the megalith builders, had been swept away, replaced by people whose ancestry pointed not to local soil, but to continental Europe. This wasn't a trickle, it was a deluge, and it came with astonishing precision. The dominant male lineage, R1b M269, appeared almost overnight. Before the Beakers, it was virtually absent. After them, it became the rule. Within a few centuries, it accounted for nearly every Y chromosome found in Britain. A single paternal line, reshaped across a nation. But this wasn't only about men. Women migrated too. Genetic data from burials show maternal lineages shifting alongside the paternal ones. Mitochondrial haplogroups previously uncommon in Britain, such as U4I and R1a, began to appear in significant numbers. This was not an invasion of warriors. It was a migration of entire communities, fathers, mothers, children, all carrying with them a genetic template that would remake an island's future. And yet, despite the scale of the change, there's no archaeological record of mass conflict, no cities in flames, no mass graves of resistance. The transition, it seems, was quiet, but not gentle. It left no visible scars, but its traces are written in the bones of every generation that followed. Scientists are still unraveling the mechanism behind this transformation. Did disease clear the way? Did the newcomers bring economic systems that outcompete the old? Were climate shifts at play, weakening the Neolithic populations before the Beaker wave arrived? Or did social structures evolve in a way that allowed foreign males greater reproductive success, replacing lineages across time without a single blade drawn? Whatever the answer, the result is undeniable. The builders of Stonehenge, once thought to be the ancestral bedrock of Britain, left behind monuments, but almost no descendants. The genetic signatures of their lives were overwritten, their stories silenced by the rise of a new ancestry that now defines the modern British genome. By the end of the Beaker period, the people living in Britain were closer, genetically, to those from the Rhine or the Netherlands than to the very ancestors who had inhabited the island just a few centuries earlier. And in their bones, we see the beginning of a new era, one shaped by the echo of distant migrations and the fading pulse of those who had once called the land home. This wasn't just population turnover. It was a genomic quake, a deep, tectonic shift that cracked the very foundation of what it meant to be native to Britain. The aftershocks still rumble in the genes of millions today. Long before the first recorded word of Latin or Celtic, long before Europe knew alphabets or carved histories, a linguistic seed was already taking root. It came not in scrolls or tablets, but in footsteps, in migrations, in DNA, and the Bell Beaker expansion, once thought to be only about pottery and metal, now emerges as a likely conduit for something far more enduring: language. The threads of Indo European speech stretch across half the planet, from the Indian subcontinent to the western shores of Ireland. But their origin, and the paths they followed, remain elusive. Linguists long suspected a link between these languages and the herders of the Pontic Caspian steppe. Geneticists, meanwhile, traced the same steppe ancestry into the bodies of beaker-associated individuals across Western Europe. When the data converged, it painted a picture not just of people moving, but of tongues traveling with them. The Bell Beaker expansion into Central and Western Europe closely follows the spread of steppe-related DNA and, by extension, the likely carriers of early Indo-European dialects. The arrival of R1b M269 males across these regions wasn't just a genetic event, it was potentially a phonetic one. These men didn't just reshape the gene pool. They may have brought new words, new grammatical structures, new ways of naming the world. Some scholars now propose that the spread of Proto-Celtic and Italo-Celtic languages was not an abstract drift, but a literal movement of people tied to the Beaker horizon. This theory gains strength in areas where steppe ancestry sharply rises, such as Britain and France, aligning with the oldest identifiable traces of Indo-European languages in the region. The match is not perfect. No ancient script confirms it, but the symphony between genes and speech is too synchronized to ignore. What makes this hypothesis powerful isn't certainty. It's convergence. DNA, archaeology, and linguistics, long treated as separate disciplines, are now pointing in the same direction, and the Beaker expansion may be the moment where they all meet. As the Beaker tide rolled across Europe, it did not move with uniform strength. In some regions, it swept away what came before. In others, it mingled gently, leaving layers rather than fractures. France and the Low Countries are where this gradient becomes visible, a subtle interplay of persistence and replacement that reshaped communities without erasing them entirely. In northern France, ancient DNA reveals a rapid rise in steppe ancestry, echoing patterns seen in Britain. Here, R1b M269 males appear in high numbers, marking a strong genetic influence from continental Beaker migrants. But in the southwest, the shift was more muted. Steppe ancestry shows up in smaller proportions, and traces of Neolithic lineages survive, particularly through maternal lines. This uneven spread tells a deeper story. Migration wasn't always absolute. It was negotiated. In the Netherlands, the genetic picture aligns strikingly with modern populations. Individuals from the Beaker period in this region closely resemble today's Dutch and English genomes. It suggests that the Beaker arrival here wasn't a passing phase. It was a foundational moment. The people who came stayed, built, reproduced, and became the genetic core of northwestern Europe. Isotopic studies add another layer. They show that Beaker individuals in this region were often mobile in childhood, raised in one landscape and buried in another. This suggests long-distance movement not as exception, but as norm. Families moved across rivers and frontiers, carrying both their DNA and their cultural toolkit. The archaeological record supports this picture of gradual integration. Local ceramic styles blend with Beaker motifs. Burial rites mix old and new. Rather than a cultural overwrite, we see a kind of fusion, a soft revolution etched into both grave goods and genomes. While the Beaker phenomenon surged across the north and west, it also reached into southern Europe, though its path there was slower, more fragmented. In northern Italy, evidence emerges not as a flood, but as a series of gentle waves, cresting in different valleys at different times. Yet the impact, once measured genetically, was unmistakable. Burials near Parma show steppe ancestry arriving by the early 2nd millennium BC. Among the male individuals, R1b M269 appears again, anchoring Italy to the broader Beaker network. But unlike Britain or the Rhine, here the newcomers did not fully replace the local population. Instead, they mixed. Their genes layered onto a deep-rooted Chalcolithic base, creating a hybrid society that preserved older lineages while adapting to new influences. This dynamic would continue into the Bronze Age. The Etruscans, a famously enigmatic people, show genetic links to Beaker-descended populations. The Latins, progenitors of Rome, also carry steppe ancestry, though in lower amounts. It suggests that while Beaker genes entered Italy, they did so through gradual diffusion, rather than sweeping conquest. Even in the Alps, traces of movement are found. Valleys that today feel isolated were once corridors, channeling people, language, and innovation from one world to another. The Beaker horizon touched them all, not always visibly, but genetically, unmistakably. To understand the reach of the Bell Beaker world, we must look to the edges, to islands and peninsulas, to the places where influence whispers rather than shouts. In these peripheries, the Beaker footprint is faint, but present, and what it reveals is astonishing. In Greece, Beaker-associated DNA is minimal, yet its presence suggests distant contact. Bronze Age remains in the Aegean show traces of ancestry linked to Central European Beaker groups. These may be the result of trade, marriage alliances, or mercenary movement, but they confirm that the Beaker world reached farther than its pottery ever did. On the Canary Islands, genetic studies of the indigenous Guanche population reveal a remarkable statistic. Up to 18% of their ancestry traces back to Central European Beaker sources. How that lineage crossed thousands of kilometers and an ocean remains unclear. But the data is there, encoded in bone and blood. Cyprus offers another surprise. Burials dated to around 1700 BC contain individuals with Scandinavian-like ancestry and isotopic signatures, suggesting they were not native. One even carries haplogroup I1, typically Northern European. These are fragments, yes, but powerful ones. They show that mobility in the Beaker era extended to regions once thought isolated. In the stillness of ancient graves, we glimpse not only the dead, but the living who buried them. Beaker funerals were not random acts of disposal. They were rituals, shaped by memory and meaning. And within them lie clues to the social worlds these people built. Across Europe, DNA analysis reveals that many Beaker burials included close relatives, parents with children, siblings interred side by side. Some were buried in postures of embrace, others beneath shared markers. These patterns point to strong kinship ties, and perhaps to patrilineal traditions where land and memory flowed through the male line. Yet the maternal presence is equally strong. Women moved with the migrations. Their genomes show up far from their birthplaces, suggesting marriage networks that spanned vast distances. These were not isolated nuclear families, but wide-reaching clans connected across frontiers. Funeral practices, too, speak of shared values. From Britain to the Rhine, the presence of standard grave goods, archery equipment, copper blades, beakers themselves, points to a common symbolic language. What those symbols meant may be lost to us, but their repetition suggests a belief system carried across generations and geographies. Today, long after the last Beaker was buried, their legacy endures in the most intimate place, our DNA. In Britain, in France, across the Netherlands and into Iberia, the genes of Beaker descendants form the bedrock of modern populations. Haplogroup R1b M269, once a rarity, is now the most common male lineage in Western Europe. Traits they carried, lighter skin, blue or green eyes, taller stature, remain common. Even the ability to digest milk, once rare, began to rise after their time. The languages we speak, the boundaries we draw, the very idea of Europe as a shared genetic space, all trace lines back to the Beaker expansion. But their true legacy is larger than biology. It is the revelation that history is not static, that the people we thought were timeless could vanish, that silence in the archaeological record may not mean stillness, but transition. The Bell Beaker story is not just one of migration. It is the reminder that who we are has always been shaped by those willing to move, to mix, and to begin again. Underneath the soil of Europe, beneath layers of silence and dust, the Bell Beaker people left no written words, only vessels, bones, and blood. But those were enough. They tell us that cultures can spread without conquest, that genes can move without war, that identity in every era is a dance between memory and change. From Iberia to Britain, from the Alps to the Atlantic, they reshaped the genetic map of a continent, not as an empire, not as a kingdom, but as a current. invisible, irresistible. Their story is not a footnote. It is a foundation, and its echoes live on in our faces, our languages, our shared past. If this journey stirred something in you, a question, a memory, a reflection, don't let it fade. Comment below, share the story, and join us as we uncover the next forgotten chapter of our ancient human saga.